Chapter 311, The Hoff Family's Banquet. At New Bay Grand Hotel, a custom-made Rolls-Royce Phantom stopped at the hotel entrance. The hotel staff immediately approached as they recognized the car. It belonged to the Hoff family. In New Bay, nobody dared to disrespect the god of gambling. They all treated him with the utmost respect. Gene stepped out of the car with an unpleasant expression. He quickened his steps toward the hotel's luxurious suite. "Hold on!" Outside the suite, Sylvia stopped him. The god of war's room lay ahead. She couldn't allow anyone to pass easily. Normally, the Hoff family members would have slapped anyone who dared to stop in their way. However, facing Sylvia, Gene dared not be rude. He knew who she worked for. "Miss, please inform Mr. Lynch that the heir of the Hoff family is here to meet him," he politely requested. "Wait here," Sylvia disdainfully replied. With that, she turned around and entered Caspian's luxurious suite. Gene dared not say much as he knew Caspian wasn't someone he could mess with. "Caspian, the heir of the Hoff family wishes to wish you," Sylvia announced upon entering the suite. "Is that so? Bring him in." Caspian was sitting casually on the sofa while making tea. Sylvia nodded and left the room. "Is Mr. Lynch available now?" Gene asked eagerly. "Come in," she said icily. With that, she opened the door to the luxurious suite. Gene patted his chest and took a breath. He had never been this nervous before. Upon entering the suite, he saw Caspian leisurely brewing tea on the sofa. Gene was momentarily stunned as he didn't expect Caspian to be so young. They looked to be of the same age. Perhaps Caspian was a few years older than him, but his deep eyes were impenetrable. "I'm Gene. Nice to meet you, Mr. Lynch." Gene didn't dare to show any disrespect as he spoke with the utmost deference. "Do you need something?" Caspian asked casually. "Mr. Lynch, the Hoff family is hosting a banquet today. My father would like to invite you. Do you have the time?" Gene smiled and took out an invitation. Lowering his head, he respectfully handed it to Caspian. For Gene, this gesture was more than polite. He had never lowered his head to anyone. "All right, I understand. I'll be there." Caspian gestured for Sylvia to take the invitation, looking indifferent. Only then did Gene relax a bit. He had initially thought Caspian wouldn't agree. Unexpectedly, Caspian agreed to it instantly. Wasn't he afraid that it might be a trap? Looking at Caspian's indifferent demeanor, Gene was perplexed. "Very well. We'll be waiting for your arrival," Gene said before promptly leaving the suite. He sensed Caspian's overwhelming presence and felt uncomfortable staying a little longer. After Gene left, Caspian leaned back on the sofa and squinted his eyes. Sylvia had already investigated the powers in New Bay. He had also heard about Charles, who was known as the god of gambling but had never gambled himself. He had trained numerous experts and easily won money from others. Charles' show of goodwill was likely a test. At the thought of this, Caspian's lips curved into a faint smile. Caspian found Charles interesting and hoped he wouldn't be easily frightened, as Caspian was determined to rectify New Bay. To reform the casino's atmosphere, he needed to deal with the god of gambling. It was without a doubt that Charles had done numerous illegal activities to get to where he was now. Though Charles rarely showed himself now and delegated most of his power to his son, Caspian needed to be careful when dealing with him. Willow! Willow! Suddenly, Carl entered the luxurious suite with a hint of urgency. "Dad, do you need something from Willow?" Caspian asked. "Where's Willow? Can you ask her when we're returning to South Lake City?" Carl urgently asked. He didn't want to stay here any longer. As he finished speaking, Willow emerged from the bathroom. "Dad, why are you here?" Willow asked, puzzled.
"I want to ask when we'll return to South Lake City,"
Carl repeated. "We're in no rush now. Caspian and I still have some unfinished business," she replied. She knew Caspian must have important matters to handle. "What business could you two possibly have?" "Oh, who sent this invitation?" Carl grabbed the invitation. "The Hoff family." He was shocked after reading it. "What Hoff family?" Willow asked with curiosity. She had no idea what Carl was talking about. "Daughter, do you know the god of gambling?" Carl asked excitedly. "I don't know him." "Hubby, did they invite you to something?" Willow looked at Caspian and asked. Carl, too, looked at Caspian. "That's right. They invited me to a banquet," Caspian said indifferently. "What? Son-in-law? Can we discuss something? How about taking me along?" Carl suddenly smiled with narrowed eyes. He had heard many rumors about the god of gambling and wanted to witness him in action. Caspian was dumbfounded. His father-in-law was quite adept at gauging the situation. "Dad, why do you want to come along?" Willow stepped in to intervene. "Willow, it's fine. If Dad wants to go, I'll bring him along." "You should come too," Caspian said casually. For him, having one more person or one less didn't matter. Meanwhile, Charles was at Hoff Manor. "Well done. Notify the staff immediately and prepare for tonight's banquet." He nodded in satisfaction. "Yes." Jean nodded and prepared to leave. "Hold on." Unexpectedly, Charles stopped him. "Dad, what is it? Do you have more instructions?" Jean turned and asked. "Immediately send an invitation to Wendell as well." "Separate the timings," Charles contemplated before speaking. "What? This?" Jean became more confused about his father's intentions. Caspian and Wendell were enemies. Inviting them both might lead to trouble. What if they fought at the dinner table? "Don't waste time. Just follow my instructions. You'll understand later." Charles chuckled. Jean nodded without further questioning. Watching Jean leave, Charles squinted his eyes as a sly smile appeared on his face. "Caspian, I want to see what you're truly capable of." Night fell, and Hoff Manor was illuminated by lights. All the domestic helpers and bodyguards grew incredibly tense. They sensed something was about to happen. "Dad, Caspian is here. He brought his wife and father-in-law." Jean suddenly approached Charles to report. Upon hearing this, Charles rose abruptly. "Let's go. I want to meet Caspian," he said sternly. "Dad, you..." Jean was taken aback. In all these years, he had never seen his father personally welcome anyone. Even when the governor of New Bay visited, Charles hadn't gone out to welcome him. Yet today, with Caspian's arrival, he seemed nervous and even wanted to welcome him. Wasn't it a bit of an overreaction? "Don't stand there. Hurry and join me in welcoming our esteemed guest." Charles glanced at his son, urging him. He didn't dare to underestimate Caspian. Just the available information displayed Caspian's esteemed status. If they offended such a big shot, it might lead to a deadly situation. It was better to be cautious. A business car parked outside the Hoff family's manor. "This place is really grand," Carl exclaimed as soon as he got out of the car. Chapter 312 ranked among the wealthiest. Carl had never seen such a luxurious villa before. The area here was overwhelmingly vast. The villas he had seen in South Lake City couldn't be compared to this. Hoff Manor covered thousands of acres. Charles had invested a considerable amount in it. The entire estate was fully equipped, even featuring a small river running through the grounds. Even cars could drive around within the estate. This showed how wealthy Charles was. "Dad, can you not act like this? Otherwise, people will think we're uncultured," Willow said somewhat speechlessly. She suddenly felt her father had undergone a drastic change recently, especially after losing his money. He seemed like a completely different person. Before this, Carl lived a plain life in the Stewart family and didn't seem interested in this flashy world. Now, he had changed. Willow hoped he wouldn't become like her mother. "All right, I got it. I don't need you to lecture me," Carl impatiently replied. Willow wanted to say more, but Caspian patted her hand, signaling her not to continue. Carl had just lost so much money, so it was understandable he was emotionally unstable. It was also normal for him to be a little smug after escaping death. "Greetings, Mr. Lynch. I apologize for not personally greeting you at the door." Charles, accompanied by his son, arrived at the villa's entrance. Although Charles was old, he appeared vigorous. With just a few words, he drew the attention of many. "God of gambling, you're flattering me. It's my honor that you've come to greet me," Caspian smiled. "Mr. Lynch, you're too kind. The title God of Gambling is just a random nickname. You can address me by my name," Charles said, shaking his head. As they conversed, they sized each other up. Charles was shocked to see that Caspian was much younger than he'd imagined. Although young, Caspian exuded a powerful aura and remarkable composure. It was evident that he had a lot of experience in life. He also emitted a sense of solemnity, as though he had experienced many dangerous experiences. This kind of imposing presence was only possessed by those who had been through countless battles. Although Caspian had been in the military, his experience wouldn't be that vast, right? Or perhaps he had another identity. Charles couldn't read him. It was the first time he felt this way. Caspian was inscrutable. His eyes showed no information. At that moment, Charles suddenly felt a bit flustered. He hadn't felt like this for a while. For the first time in over a decade, he found someone slightly terrifying. Caspian was so calm that he induced a sense of fear in others. At the same time, Caspian was also assessing Charles. Charles deserved the title of god of gambling. Despite his age, his aura remained strong. If an ordinary person encountered him, they would surely tremble in fear. But for Caspian, such an aura was nothing. He had encountered countless big shots. It's impolite to call someone by their name directly. Plus, I'm younger than you. I'll call you Mr. Hoff Sr., all right? Caspian grinned. All right, you can call me whatever you want. There's no need for formalities, Charles chuckled. At that moment, he didn't look like the god of gambling. He seemed like a friendly neighbor. His amicable facade might deceive others, but it didn't escape Caspian's eyes. When Charles was younger, he was one to kill without hesitation. However, as he grew older, he had learned to restrain himself. This was all a performance. The more Charles was like this, the more cautious Caspian became. Looking at Caspian's relaxed demeanor, Charles was taken aback. When an ordinary person met him, they would nod and lower their head, losing all composure. But Caspian remained calm. This exceeded his imagination. This further strengthened his belief that Caspian wasn't an ordinary person. You're the legendary god of gambling. Are you very wealthy? Carl suddenly spoke up. Willow's face darkened instantly. She had already told Carl not to speak carelessly, yet he asked such a blunt question. Charles was dumbfounded for a while as he didn't expect anyone to ask him a question like that so directly. However, he quickly smiled and replied, "Those are just rumors. I'm just slightly wealthier than an ordinary businessman. You're Caspian's father-in-law, right? How should I address you?" Hearing this, Caspian smiled faintly. Charles wasn't slightly wealthier. He was extremely wealthy. His net worth had long surpassed the $3 trillion mark, and he consistently ranked among Diatoran's wealthiest. "Yes, I'm Caspian's father-in-law, Carl Stewart. Just call me Carl," Carl proudly said. The god of gambling was unexpectedly courteous to him. "Nice to meet you, Carl." Charles nodded. At this moment, Carl was even prouder. He would gain a lot of respect if this got out. "Mr. Lynch, the banquet is ready. Please come in," Charles said with a smile. Caspian nodded and followed them in. "God of gambling, your residence is truly luxurious," Carl hurriedly followed. "Dad, can you stop speaking so carelessly?" Willow said irritably. "Am I embarrassing you? Is that why you won't let me speak? Now that you're the CEO of South Lake Corporation, you don't care about me, do you? Do you want to cut ties with me? Besides, we're guests. Didn't you see how polite the god of gambling was to me?" he exclaimed. "Could speak a bit softer. You know you're a guest. Yet you're speaking recklessly," she said. "I just want to be friends with the god of gambling," he retorted. Hearing this, Willow didn't know how to respond. She was too lazy to deal with it and followed Caspian into the villa. Led by Charles and Jean, everyone came into the hall. The hall was exquisitely decorated, featuring a particularly large and luxurious crystal chandelier in the center. It was obvious that it was expensive. Even the cutlery on the dining table was made of gold. The spoons and forks were all cast in gold. Carl was stunned at the sight of such luxury. He had never seen such a luxurious place before. Chapter 313, The God of Gambling is Irritated. Carl seemed like someone who hadn't seen much as he was touching and examining the gold cutlery. "Heavens, are these all pure gold? It seems they're even inlaid with gemstones," Carl exclaimed, picking up a gold spoon. Looking at his astonishment, Charles could only manage an awkward smile while occasionally shooting fierce glares. If it weren't for Caspian's presence, he wouldn't have allowed someone like Carl into the villa. However, Carl was now quite pleased, thoroughly enjoying everything. "Willow, the god of gambling's residence is truly different. Can you see how everything glitters with gold? This must have cost a lot, right?" Carl said excitedly. "Dad, can you stop talking?" Willow whispered irritably. "Never mind, you won't understand even if I explain. I'll just wander around by myself," he said as he began admiring things around. Seeing Carl's behavior, Caspian felt somewhat helpless. "Mr. Lynch, please have a seat." Charles ignored Carl and smiled at Caspian. Nodding, Caspian followed him to the dinner table. The table was filled with delicious delicacies including caviar, lobster, and much more. There were a dozen or so domestic helpers standing respectfully nearby. They all served exclusively for tonight's feast. "Mr. Lynch, please take the main seat." Charles pointed at the head of the long table. "Mr. Hoff Sr., that's not appropriate. I'm the guest and younger than you. How could I sit in the main seat?" Caspian declined. The more respected one's status, the more they adhered to dining etiquette. "Mr. Lynch, you're a distinguished guest I personally invited. It's only appropriate that you sit here." Charles smiled. "In that case, I'll respect your intentions." Chuckling, Caspian sat down directly. As the Diatoran god of war, it was appropriate for him to sit in the main seat. Yet, as soon as Caspian sat down, a dark shadow crossed Charles' face. Arrogant! Caspian was too arrogant. However, Charles quickly adjusted his demeanor and smiled. On the other hand, Jean couldn't bear it as he stood there. He had never seen anyone so audacious in front of his father, even daring to occupy the main seat. Even when Alton came before, he didn't dare to sit on the main seat. Who did Caspian think he was? Was he more influential than the governor? "Mr. Lynch, I never expected you to be so disrespectful. You're a junior, yet you chose to sit in the main seat," Jean said with irritation. "Shut up! You have no right to speak," Charles reprimanded. "Mr. Hoff Sr., it seems your son has some grievances against me. How about this? I'll let you have this seat," Caspian smiled. "No need, Mr. Lynch. It's my fault for not educating him well, which led him to disrespect you." Charles hurriedly shook his head and cast a cold glance at Jean. Quickly apologized to Mr. Lynch. Jean felt somewhat helpless. He couldn't understand why his father was so courteous to Caspian. But he didn't dare to go against his father's wishes. "Mr. Lynch, I apologize for being rude." Jean lowered his head and apologized. "It's all right. Young people are impulsive, so I don't take offense," Caspian said calmly. Hearing this, Jean's face turned livid. Caspian was only a few years older than him. Yet, he chastised him as if he were an elder. Charles' face darkened as he glared at Caspian. But in the next moment, a smile appeared on his face again. Caspian completely disregarded them. He maintained a calm demeanor as if he were detached from the situation. Willow was puzzled. Caspian had always been humble and gentle, so why was he different today? Also, the banquet seemed odd. "Charles, if you're so eager to understand me, then let me show you what I'm capable of." Caspian thought to himself. The atmosphere at the dining table grew tense, as if a fight would erupt at any moment. "Oh my! There's so much food. Why is everyone standing around?" A familiar voice sounded. Carl walked over and was astonished at the spread of delicacies on the table. Having lived in South Lake City for most of his life, he had never eaten such a sumptuous dinner. "Caspian, I haven't taken a seat yet, but you're already sitting in the main seat. Is this a spot for you?" Carl pulled Caspian up and took the main seat himself. Witnessing this scene, everyone was stunned. It might have been acceptable for him to sit in the main seat in the Stewart household, and Caspian wouldn't have minded it either. But this was the god of gambling's banquet. Caspian shook his head helplessly and took a seat nearby. Willow massaged her forehead, feeling extremely helpless. She wanted to leave quickly. Charles and Jean couldn't accept it at all. Their faces turned livid upon seeing Carl sitting down. They could tolerate Caspian sitting in the main seat, considering his identity was still secretive, and he could possibly be a big shot. But what was Carl? What qualifications did he have to sit there? If the people from New Bay found out, the Hoff family would be a laughingstock. But Carl didn't care as he began eating hungrily. He had endured a lot after being confined in Azuria Casino. Since there was a feast tonight, he wanted to indulge in it. Watching Carl's lack of composure, Caspian felt speechless. Carl was an embarrassment. "You're too polite. Hurry and eat. It won't taste good when it's cold," Carl said to Charles and the others. Upon hearing this, the Hoff family was speechless. This was their home. Why was Carl acting like he was the host, so self-righteous? Sighing, Charles finally sat down. "Sorry, my father-in-law is always like this. I hope you don't mind, Mr. Hoff Sr." Caspian smiled. He regretted bringing Carl here. At that moment, Charles didn't know what to say. If it were anyone else being so disrespectful at his banquet, he would have already murdered them. But Carl was Caspian's father-in-law, so he couldn't say much. Chapter 314, Dare to Gamble. Charles controlled most of the wealth in New Bay. He had witnessed all sorts of scenes. Arguing with someone like Carl was merely lowering his status. Mr. Lynch, your father-in-law is indeed unique, Charles managed an awkward smile. Caspian could discern that he was mocking him. Carl was eating a large lobster. He glanced at the helpers beside him and said, "What are you all staring at? Pour me some wine." The Hoff family's helpers were dumbfounded when they heard this. They had seen many distinguished guests, but this was the first time that they saw someone like Carl. But he was a guest, after all, and they were helpers. They didn't dare to say much and quickly poured him a glass of fine red wine. Carl raised his glass and gulped it down. He even let out a satisfied burp. "Nice. This is a very nice wine." He grinned in enjoyment. Charles' expression grew uglier. He had completely lost his appetite. He found it rather distasteful to dine with someone like this. "Hubby, I'm sorry. I didn't expect Dad to behave like this," Willow said, somewhat embarrassed. "It's fine. I don't mind," Caspian said calmly. He had no intention of getting mad at Carl. In the whole Stewart family, only Carl had a better relationship with Willow. "Mr. Lynch, your sudden visit to New Bay can't be just for leisure, right?" Charles didn't intend to waste time and asked directly. Though he still wore a smile, there was a concealed threat within it. "I'm here for a small matter. My father-in-law encountered some trouble at Azuria Casino, which led to him being detained there. I came to bring him back." Caspian held his fork and said calmly, "Is that so? Azuria Casino's people have gone too far. Mr. Lynch, rest assured, I'll definitely help you with this." Charles erupted in anger. Seeing this, Caspian secretly chuckled. The old bastard's acting was good, but it was a bit exaggerated. "It's already resolved. Azuria Casino has been sealed by the Inspector General's office, and the casino owner has been taken away." Caspian chuckled. "Good. Azuria Casino is indeed a disgrace to New Bay. Even if you hadn't intervened, I would have found a way to expel them from New Bay," Charles sternly said. "Mr. Hoff Sr., you're absolutely right. That Wendell is a beast. I didn't eat properly in the past few days, and I was kept hostage." When Carl recalled those days, he felt stifled. Seeing Carl's reaction, Charles was briefly taken aback. He was just being polite, yet Charles was pouring out his grievances to him. "They conspired against me and made me lose $800 million. Mr. Hoff Sr., I started my career from scratch back in South Lake City. $800 million is a portion of my hard-earned money." Carl's tone was pitiful and emotional. Seeing him like this made Charles feel disgusted. What was Carl up to? What did his losses have to do with him? Was Carl expecting him to give out $800 million? "Dad, can you stop talking and just eat?" Willow said impatiently. She couldn't bear watching anymore. Initially, she thought her mother, Kate, was overbearing. But now, Carl was acting unreasonably and embarrassing them at the dining table. "Willow, what do you mean?" "I'm just venting a little in front of everyone. I've lost all my savings. If your mom finds out, she'll definitely be furious." Carl glanced at Willow. $800 million wasn't a small amount, and he couldn't shake off the discomfort in his heart when he thought about the money. If the Stewart family knew about this, his position in the family would surely drop. "Let Willow compensate for the money you lost," Caspian said with a smile. "Really? Caspian, can you decide that? Besides, it's only right for my daughter to give me money," Carl said happily. $800 million wasn't a small amount, and he knew his daughter was wealthy now. "Don't worry, Willow will follow what I say." Caspian nodded. "Hubby," Willow called out. She didn't want to give Carl the money at all. It wasn't that she was unwilling, but she feared that Carl would lose it in the same manner. Caspian gently patted her hand and signaled her to stabilize Carl first. Then, he looked at Charles. With just one glance, Charles suddenly felt uneasy. There was a hint of menace in Caspian's eyes. "Mr. Hoff Sr., I heard a lot about you. Is it true that you never gamble?" Caspian asked Charles. At these words, Charles was momentarily stunned. What did Caspian mean? "That's right. I never gamble. A little gambling is fun, but too much is ruinous. Many people have gone astray due to gambling. Actually, I detest these casinos in New Bay," Charles said thoughtfully, filled with indignation. Listening to this, Caspian found it ridiculous. Here was the god of gambling sitting in front of him, and openly claiming to detest casinos. Mr. Hoff Sr., if you detest casinos, why not shut down the Hoff family's gambling industry? Caspian deliberately suggested. Charles was taken aback. He smiled and said, I hate casinos, but there's no way around it. New Bay is known as a gambling city. If I close down my family's casinos, the Hoff family will have no economic source, and the whole family will suffer. On a larger scale, New Bay might plunge into chaos. My actions might deprive many people of their livelihoods. I'm doing it for the good of the people of New Bay. Charles pretended to appear somewhat helpless. It was recognized throughout Diatorin that New Bay was known as a gambling city. If these casinos were shut down, the city would undoubtedly turn into chaos overnight. They had considered eradicating the gambling industry in New Bay, but it would deal a heavy. This was why the high-ranking officials of Diatorin had always let New Bay exist. Ha ha ha, Mr. Hoff Sr., there's no need to be so serious. I was just joking. Caspian laughed. After hearing this, Charles breathed a sigh of relief. The reason why the Hoff family was able to grow in New Bay was because of the gambling industry and some illegal activities. If these casinos were shut down, the entire Hoff family would collapse. I have an idea. I've heard that you never gamble, but I want to gamble with you. Would you be interested? Caspian suddenly changed the topic. Chapter 315, Confrontation with the God of Gambling. At his words, Charles felt a shiver down his spine. Caspian's behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Moreover, there was an air of dominance about him, as if nothing mattered in his eyes. Originally, Charles intended to figure out Caspian's background tonight. However, as the evening progressed, Caspian appeared more inscrutable. Trying to decipher him in a short time was difficult. Caspian's profound gaze was intimidating, and there was no room for error when it came to dealing with him. Oh, Mr. Lynch? You want to gamble with me? Although I don't gamble, a little fun is fine. Mr. Lynch, what do you want to play? Poker? Charles cautiously asked. I'm not interested in these traditional games. They're too boring. I can't say now how we'll gamble, but I can let you know what the stakes are. Caspian shook his head with a smile. Poker had no appeal for Caspian. Deception was rife in a game like that. As the Diatoran War of God, if he gambled, it would be on a grand scale. Oh? Mr. Lynch, do enlighten me. Charles' eyes brightened, as it had been a long time since he encountered someone as arrogant as Caspian. Even though he didn't gamble, it didn't mean he lacked skill. Charles managed to establish himself in New Bay and became a tycoon through his gambling expertise. However, now that he was older, he preferred not to personally engage at the tables. He'd rather set up his own establishments and use some tricks to make money. It's nothing much. If I lose, Azuria Casino will be yours. But if you lose, you need to give my father, in flaw, $800 million. How about that? Caspian said calmly. Carl was stunned to hear this. He hadn't expected Caspian to challenge the god of gambling. The guy was renowned as the god of gambling. It seemed nearly impossible to win money from him. Charles' expression hardened. $800 million was a trifle for him, akin to his son's pocket money. However, Caspian's wager was high as he put Azuria Casino at stake. This matter should be if he did indeed fulfill the bet. He would undoubtedly be a big shot, one with a background beyond anyone's imagination. Mr. Hoff Sr., are you interested in what I proposed? Do you dare gamble with me? Caspian fixed his gaze on Charles as he asked with a faint smile. Charles' heart stirred. Azuria Casino was one of the largest casinos in all of New Bay. Yet, due to the York family's presence, Charles couldn't act recklessly. If he could win back the casino from Caspian, it would be fantastic news for the Hoff family. From then on, no one would dare to challenge him anymore. Since you're so enthusiastic, Mr. Lynch, I can't refuse. However, Azuria Casino has been sealed by the Inspector General's office. Can your words be trusted? Charles asked. Azuria Casino had been sealed, and without Alton's command, nobody dared to touch it. Even Charles couldn't openly challenge him since he was the governor of New Bay. Seeing Caspian's confident demeanor, Charles was curious. How could he have control over Azuria Casino? Don't doubt me, Mr. Hoff Sr. I'm a man of my word. Caspian smiled. Since Caspian was so assured, Charles didn't press further. Caspian, have you gone mad? How dare you challenge the god of gambling? What happens if you lose? Carl stared at Caspian and exclaimed. Carl initially thought he could take 800 million from Willow, but he hadn't expected Caspian to have such a trick up his sleeve. Winning against the god of gambling was incredibly challenging. Dad, just trust me. Regardless, the 800 million will eventually be yours, Caspian casually replied. It better be. Willow will testify for me, Carl said. He suddenly felt that Caspian wasn't the same as previous. His presence and everything about him had changed. Hubby, isn't this too risky? Willow whispered while holding on to Caspian's arm. They say the god of gambling skills are unparalleled in New Bay. No one can beat him because there's no worthy opponent, which is why he never gambles. Willow, trust me. I'm confident. Caspian patted her hand lightly. Seeing his calm demeanor, Willow stopped persuading him. She knew he must have his own plan. Mr. Lynch, how do you plan to gamble? Charles asked with curiosity. Mr. Hoff Sr., hold your horses. Not everyone has arrived yet, Caspian said meaningfully. Seeing his appearance, Charles suddenly felt anxious. At that moment, a helper hurried in. Sir, the head of the York family, Wendell York, wishes to see you. In the next moment, Charles turned to look at Caspian. Thinking of Caspian's confident appearance just now, he felt a tremor in his heart. How did Caspian guess that he would invite Wendell? Was Caspian a wizard? Could he see into the future? Mr. Hoff Sr., he's here? Let him in so that we can begin the gambling session, Caspian said with a smile. Charles breathed a sigh of relief, trying to compose himself. He spoke sternly. Bring Wendell in. Understood, Mr. Hoff Sr. The helper nodded and hurried out. Afterward, Charles' fiery gaze locked onto Caspian. Mr. Lynch, how did you know Wendell would come? Mr. Hoff Sr., you and I don't have any dealings, but you sent me an invitation to the banquet. You wanted to use this chance to probe into my background, to understand my identity and purpose in coming to New Bay. Caspian chuckled. Wendell shares a deep relationship with you. As for us, we're enemies. To quickly understand me, inviting this person over would be the best move. Am I right, Mr. Hoff Sr.? Charles' face turned ashen. After hearing Caspian's words, he burst into laughter. Mr. Lynch, I didn't expect you to be so capable. I underestimated you before. However, I have a question. Why would someone as talented as you willingly become the Stewart family's son-in-law? While saying this, Charles glanced at Carl. Chapter 316, Extreme Arrogance. Charles was somewhat perplexed. Why would Caspian be willing to marry Willow and become the matrilocal son-in-law of the insignificant Stewart family? And this is where you're wrong, Mr. Hoff Sr. What's bad about being a matrilocal son-in-law? You don't need to do anything before the marriage or pay anything, and you'll be provided for even if you lie at home all day. Isn't that nice? And I got to marry such a beautiful wife who's also the president of a large company. Many people would want a life like mine. Caspian grinned widely. While Caspian spoke, he looped an arm around Willow's slender waist. Don't worry, honey. As long as I'm president of the company, you'll be treated well. Willow smiled shyly. Everyone was stunned at the sight of this scene. Caspian was way too infuriating. He was just a matrilocal son-in-law, and yet he acted like he was above everyone else. Caspian was right, though. The fact that he married a beautiful wife who was also president of a company was enough for many other people to envy him. You sure do view things differently from everyone else, Mr. Lynch, Charles laughed. I'm Wendell York, the head of the York family. It's an honor to meet you, the god of gambling. Right at this moment, Wendell and the others arrived at the reception hall. They were stunned. The instant they caught sight of Caspian before flames of rage rose in their hearts. Caspian Lynch, why are you also here? Wendell asked, angry and shocked. The respected god of gambling sent me an invitation. Shouldn't I be here? Caspian asked in disdain. Upon hearing that, Wendell gave Charles a perplexed look. What was Charles doing? If Charles had invited Caspian to this banquet, why was he also invited? Charles gave Caspian a look. What a quick-tongued fellow. Caspian was obviously trying to create a rift between both sides. Mr. York, you're here right on time. Mr. Lynch has agreed to make a bet. If I win it, Azuria Casino will be mine, Charles said animatedly. What? Wendell was stunned. Azuria Casino was a business owned by the York family. What right did Caspian have to decide its fate? Caspian was being disrespectful to him, the head of the York family. Caspian Lynch, you're way too arrogant. My Azuria casino is being investigated and was shut down because of you, and yet you're trying to decide its fate. Who do you think you are? Wendell asked nastily. To be honest, you're right. You're not in the picture at all, Caspian said calmly. Despite that, his words were laced with arrogance. Caspian's commanding way of speaking overwhelmed Wendell and the others. You! Wendell was so mad that his hands trembled. Caspian was way too arrogant. How dare he? Caspian Lynch, how dare you be so arrogant? You're just the matrilocal son-in-law of the Stewart family from South Lake City. The Stewart family are just aunts to us. The Yorks of Dord City. Celestia stepped forward, speaking vindictively. I didn't expect the Yorks of Dord City to sound so confident. According to what I've learned, you're just a lesser-known elite family. You'll probably become something less than that after you return to the city this time, Caspian said blandly. Willow did not pay much attention to these affairs, but she'd heard some things by virtue of being by Caspian's side often. That included how the York family of South Lake City was wiped out by Caspian. Caspian, you're way too conceited. One day, we'll wipe out the Stewart family in South Lake as well. Your wife's company too. It'll eventually become a business owned by the York family, Celestia said, her face alight with rage. Even those in Dord City would not dare to willfully antagonize the York family, and yet Caspian was so arrogant. Celestia felt humiliated. The flames of rage in her heart burned brighter and brighter. Wendell's heart sank. He knew the situation the York family was currently in, so he must think of a way to get Azuria Casino back this time. The York family would be in danger otherwise. Charles looked at Caspian and asked, Mr. Lynch, now that Wendell is here, tell me, how do you wish to gamble? At this moment, everyone turned to look at Caspian. They wanted to know what Caspian would propose against the god of gambling. Was it not a death sentence to gamble with the god of gambling? Caspian was not perturbed by their gazes. He pointed at Wendell and said, The gamble hinges on Wendell. I bet that he won't be leaving Hoff residence today. Huh? Caspian's words stunned everyone. Wendell, in particular, felt rage come over him. What the hell did Caspian's words mean? Was he about to fight him? Wendell had not experienced such humiliation before, and he could not just take it. There was already a feud between him and Caspian, and now, Caspian was publicly humiliating him. He could never just tolerate this. Wendell clenched his fist tightly. He was so enraged that he was trembling from head to toe, and his gaze was filled with so much rage they looked like they were on fire. Caspian Lynch, you arrogant man, I'll fight you to the death, Wendell roared. He was suddenly engulfed in power. He was now an eternal grandmaster, and he gave his all against Caspian, launching a punch directly toward Caspian's face. Caspian looked calm, though completely unaffected. Noticing Wendell's rage, a grin slowly bloomed on Caspian's face. This grin was one laced with disdain. Caspian launched a punch as well. It was done so swiftly the air rippled with his strength. With a heavy thud, Wendell was sent flying, and he landed on the floor. Caspian, on the other hand, had slowly made his way back to his seat. Upon seeing that, Charles's expression turned serious. Caspian seemed to be extremely powerful. Even an eternal grandmaster like Wendell was not able to take a punch from him. That was why he attended the banquet with a leisurely ease. It was because he had the power to back him up. Dad, Celestia called panikedly. The moment Wendell landed on the floor, he spat out a glob of blood. Dad, are you okay? Celestia looked at Wendell with concern. Wendell's pitiful state made her heart hurt. I'm fine. Wendell shook his head. This was his first time going up against Caspian directly. He had heard Cole talk about how powerful Caspian was, but he had thought that Cole was exaggerating. Now, though, he believed everything. With just one punch, Caspian had showcased what he was capable of. That was why he could wipe out Mahayan Pavilion and Galacrest. Caspian was only in his 20s, and yet he possessed such overwhelming power. This was really hard to accept. Wendell had been practicing martial arts for decades. He was also supported by the York family, which allowed him to obtain the resources necessary. That was why he could achieve what he had today. However, Caspian was more powerful than him despite his young age. What was the true extent of his power? Wendell gave Cole, who was beside him. A look. Cole was standing there, looking impassive as if he had predicted that this would happen. How infuriating! How maddening! Cole knew that he would never stand a chance against Caspian, and yet Cole had not reminded him. It was because he wanted Wendell to embarrass himself in public. Now, Wendell was filled with rage directed at Cole as well. If he ever got the chance, he would surely show Cole the consequences of his actions. Chapter 317, Are you brave enough to bet on it? Charles' face had also darkened at the sight. Caspian had suddenly punched Wendell, which surprised Charles somewhat. They were in his territory, and Wendell was also considered one of his guests. Despite that, Caspian had punched Wendell, completely disrespecting Charles. Mr. Lynch, we're in Hoff residence, and Mr. York is my guest. And yet you attacked him thoughtlessly. Isn't this a show of disrespect toward me? Charles said, his face dark. Ha ha ha. I forgot about you, Mr. Hoff Sr. A useless man wanted to attack me, though. Was I supposed to stand there and let him beat me up? Caspian said with a grin. Wendell, who was already in a pathetic state, felt rage engulf his heart again upon hearing Caspian's words. He felt himself choking up. Caspian had called him useless. Everyone present could feel how intent Wendell's glare was. He wanted nothing more than to burn Caspian until he turned to ash. It was not just Wendell. Anyone else would be enraged after being humiliated by Caspian in this manner. They turned to look at Caspian, who looked calm as he stared at Charles intently. Mr. Hoff Sr., are you brave enough to wager against me? Charles paused. Caspian was incredibly powerful and came from a mysterious background. If he were to wager against Caspian, he was not fully confident that he could win. Just agree to it, god of gambling. If you lose, I'll cover the costs, Wendell said vindictively. He must take revenge. He had not suffered from such humiliation before, not even in Dord City. How dare Caspian humiliate him in this way? If word about how he did not retaliate against Caspian was spread, he could forget about establishing his presence in Dord City. Caspian, I also want to know what methods you can use to contain me in this place, Wendell roared. Upon hearing that, Charles made up his mind as well. He looked at Caspian with a smile. If that's so, I'll wager against you. Great! It's 10 at night now, so let's bet that Wendell will die here in Hoff residence before 10:30. Sounds good? Caspian glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. Caspian, how dare you be so arrogant? Who do you think you are? You're just the maître local son, in law of the Stuart family. Even if you did join the army for several years and have connections in the army, this shouldn't be the reason behind your arrogance. Wendell flew into a rage. Caspian had insulted him time after time. Did Caspian really think of himself as a god? How dare Caspian think that he could decide the time of Wendell's death? Would he be so bold as to attack in public, in Hoff residence? Let me see what tricks you have in store, Caspian Lynch, Wendell roared. Caspian was powerful, indeed, but he would never attack when there were so many people around him. Charles would not just stand there and watch either. You don't believe me, it seems. Let's wait and see, Caspian said meaningfully, looking at Wendell. I have my doubts about how that can happen too. Unless you plan to kill Mr. York in public, Mr. Lynch, Charles said, shaking his head. If Caspian planned to kill Wendell, there was no way he would just watch from the sidelines. This was his territory, and he was the one who had invited Wendell. If Wendell ended up dying here, this would also harm Charles' reputation. Kill him? I wouldn't want to dirty my hands, Caspian said in disdain. You bastard! Wendell was shaking in rage. As he pointed at Caspian, his hands kept shaking. Caspian had really gone overboard. I haven't met anyone as arrogant as you. Let me see if you have the guts to kill me today, Wendell said angrily. Do whatever you want. I don't want to exchange meaningless words with a dead man, Caspian said blandly. Wendell was so furious he could not speak. He wanted nothing more than to cut Caspian into pieces, but he was no match for Caspian. The short confrontation just now had made him wary. He was already old and could not handle any more torture. The atmosphere became tense all of a sudden. Don't just stand there. Everyone. Mr. Hoff Sr. has prepared so much good food for us, so let's dig in, Caspian said with a smile after taking a sip of red wine. Everyone looked at Caspian in disbelief, save for Willow, who nodded and continued enjoying the food. Carl also looked nonchalant as he continued enjoying the delicacies as if whatever was happening right now was none of his business. He did not want to get involved in the affairs between Caspian and these people. If there was any trouble, he would surely be the first one to sneak off. Carl was surprised though. When did his son-in-law, seen by many as useless, become so powerful? He conducted himself with so much confidence, too. He was utterly calm and collected in front of the god of gambling and had also made a wager against him, all while appearing to be prepared. Willow was not worried about Caspian. She had an approximate idea of Caspian's power, so she was also curious about how Wendell would end up dead. Time passed. Soon, it was almost 20 minutes past 10. Only 10 minutes were left until the time was up. Ha ha ha. Didn't you say that I would die soon? It's almost time, Wendell said gleefully. There were only a few minutes to the time limit. Wendell wanted to see for himself what tricks Caspian had up his sleeve. It's almost time. What a strange man you are, gagging for your death like this. Caspian eyed Wendell, saying coldly, "You bastard!" Hearing Caspian's insults, Wendell was alight with fury. Not only could he not win against Caspian in a fight, but he had also fallen short in a verbal battle. How useless! Humph! Wendell turned his head sideways and decided to not say anything. He wanted to see what tricks Caspian was capable of. Time passed quickly, and only 2 minutes were left. It would be 10:30 very soon after, but Wendell remained safe and sound. Only 2 minutes are left, Caspian, but nothing has happened to me. Let's see how you can still put on that mysterious act, Wendell spat out. It seems that I'll be winning this bet. Mr. Lynch, Azuria Casino will be mine, Charles guffawed. As the god of gambling, he had never lost a single bet. Next, Charles said to Wendell beside him, Mr. York, when I get my hands on Azuria Casino, I'll return it to you in perfect condition. Thank you, Mr. Hoff Sr. The York family will never forget what you did for us. If you ever need anything in the future, just say the word, Wendell said joyfully. The banquet became peaceful once more. Charles and Wendell toasted each other and praised each other to the skies. Celestia was feeling increasingly gleeful too, as she felt that Caspian would surely lose the bet. However, Caspian remained seated and was enjoying the food calmly. After eating, he wiped his hands with a tissue. He was not panicked at all, as if everything was under his control. Caspian lifted his glass and swayed it slightly. Under the lights, the glass glistened. He took a sip of red wine before saying, "It's here!" Wendell's gaze was filled with disdain as he looked at Caspian. "He's still committed to the act," Wendell sneered. Charles and the others were also looking at Caspian contemptuously. They felt like Caspian was pretending to be calm while feeling more anxious than anyone else. Anxious. Chapter 318 The York family is about to collapse. As time passed, Willow, who was initially not worried at all, became slightly anxious as well. "Are you confident that you can win? Honey, can you really do it?" Willow whispered. "You should know if I'm good at doing it, shouldn't you, darling? Haven't I done you enough times for you to know?" Caspian chuckled. Willow paused for a moment upon hearing that. She took a few seconds to get the joke. After that, her face flushed as she pinched Caspian. They were in such a dire situation already, and yet Caspian was nonchalant enough to joke with her. "Caspian, as you've promised me, I want my 800 million back regardless if you win or lose this bet. I want the exact amount, not a single cent less than that," Carl said coldly. He did not care about Wendell's fate. He just wanted his money back. If the Stewart family learned that he had lost all that money, he would be in an even lower position at home. "Mr. Lynch, it's already 10:30 now," Charles got up and said. "We still have 5 more seconds until that." Caspian raised his hand. Everyone was stunned by that. What could turn the situation around in 5 seconds? Was Caspian pretending to be calm, or did he really have something up his sleeve? "Caspian, don't even think that you can kill me," Wendell sneered. His worries were completely gone now. There were only a few seconds left. What could Caspian do to him? "Caspian, the next one to die should be you," Celestia snapped vindictively. Cole sat there, silent from the start. No one could know how things would end up until the last moment, so Cole dared not be careless. Caspian did not entertain anyone else. He grinned, saying indifferently, 3, 2, 1, they're here." Right after Caspian said that, There was a loud noise outside. The door to Hoff residence opened, and a group of people surged in. Bastards! Who dares enter the Hoff residence to make a scene? Jean got up, bellowing. The Hoff family was already unlucky enough today. Not only were they insulted by Caspian, but now these people were charging into the residence without permission. Did they think that the Hoff family was so easy a target? Just as Jean was about to corral his men, he happened to see what was happening in the yard outside, which dumbfounded him. Military vehicles were driving into the yard, one after another. Fully armed soldiers jumped out of those cars. These soldiers did not hesitate at all before quickly assuming combat mode. They surrounded Hoff residence. Upon the sight of this, everyone was stunned. What the hell was happening? Why were so many soldiers here? Charles was especially panicked. Were all these people here for him? Before Charles could continue on that train of thought, Jackson came over. At the sight of Deputy Gibson, Charles breathed out a sigh of relief. He was on good terms with Alton. Thankfully, those soldiers were here with people he knew. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Gibson. May I know why you're visiting?" Charles got up and welcomed Jackson. However, Jackson ignored Charles and directly made his way to Wendell. "Wendell York, Kieran York has told us everything about the crimes you've committed. Azuria Casino, which is a business under the York family, has broken the law in multiple aspects. As you're the one who truly has the say over the casino, you're to assist us in our investigation." Jackson stood in front of Wendell and spoke coldly. Wendell froze on the spot. Taken aback, he turned back and gave Caspian a look. Suddenly, he had a realization. "Caspian, you bastard! You must be the one behind all this!" Wendell bellowed, face twisted in rage. Caspian sat there and sipped his wine. He laughed. "Regardless if I'm the one who did it, it doesn't matter now. It looks like you're going to be executed soon." Only now did Wendell figure out why Caspian had been so fearless as to make a wager against the god of gambling. He had planned everything. His goal was to ensure Wendell was arrested, and Wendell had sat here like an idiot, waiting to be arrested. How abominable! Caspian was way too horrible. Kieran had initially put up a fight after being caught, but he was intimidated into telling the authorities everything. He even reported Wendell, attempting to pull Wendell down with him. After having a sufficient chain of evidence, Alton immediately issued an order. At this moment, Charles was looking at Caspian strangely, his eyes showing a hint of terror. After making a living in New Bay for decades, Charles had done many other deeds that could never see the light. Caspian had orchestrated a sudden raid aimed at Wendell. One day, it would be Charles who was met with this fate. Charles was filled with more worry at that thought. All the properties and businesses he had put so much effort into were in New Bay. If he ever got himself into a situation like this someday, what should he do to defuse it? Charles felt this unprecedented sense of danger for the first time in decades. He should prepare for the future. On the surface, it seemed like the Hoff family dominated New Bay, but they were still helpless against the governor's office. "This is an arrest order signed by the governor himself. Come with me, Mr. York." Jackson took an arrest order out and said coldly, "Ha ha ha. Do you think I'll do what you say obediently?" "You're too naive," Wendell guffawed madly. The next second, he grabbed the arrest order in Jackson's hands and tore it into shreds. "Let's see what you can do to arrest me." Wendell roared until his throat was hoarse. Wendell was not stupid. He knew that he would never have the chance to turn the situation around if he was arrested today. Rather than surrendering, he might as well give it his all and resist it. Maybe he would have a chance at getting out of this alive. Jackson's face darkened when Wendell tore the arrest order up. He said coldly, "Wendell York, you're interfering with official affairs and refusing to work with us. It seems like you have a death wish. Huh? Men, cuff Wendell York up," Jackson ordered. Several soldiers rushed over and took out pairs of metal handcuffs. "Fuck off," Wendell bellowed as he punched with both hands. The soldiers fell onto the floor. "You dare attack?" Jackson could not tolerate this any longer. He took out his gun and aimed it at Wendell. With a bang, the bullet was fired. Wendell froze for a moment. When he realized what was happening, it was already too late. The bullet was shot into his heart. With a loud thump, Wendell collapsed onto the floor, dead. How could he dare to resist his arrest? "It's like he decided that he had lived for too long," Jackson said indifferently while tucking his gun back into its holster. "We're leaving." Jackson waved his hand in the air. More than a dozen military vehicles drove out of Hoff residence. Jackson had only been here for 1 minute, but he had moved fast and had not given Wendell any time to react. Everyone present was greatly shocked. Wendell York, the head of the Yorks of Dord City, was killed by a gunshot just like that. Chapter 319, Blinded by Hatred. Looking at Jackson's retreating back, everyone came back to their senses. "Dad, you're freaking me out!" Celestia sank to the floor beside Wendell and cried hoarsely. "Dad, don't leave me alone. Don't abandon me." Celestia's cries were extremely pitiable, her helplessness palpable. She had grown up under the protection of her father. Now that her protector had suddenly fallen, she could not accept it at all. For her, this was no different from the collapse of the sky above her head. From now on, her life would be as unstable as a lone boat in the sea. No one would be there to shield her from troubles and resolve her difficulties. Caspian was touched by this scene at first, but he quickly abandoned this thought. Wendell deserved his death. He had done many dirty deeds, and many civilians had been the victims of his crimes. Faced with Wendell's death, Charles froze on the spot. Wendell York, the head of the York family from Dord City, had died in Hoff residence. Even Charles was shocked by that development. Wendell's death was linked to Caspian, and Charles had done as many bad deeds as Wendell. He would probably be met with the same downfall as Wendell's. Charles gave Caspian a look, and he discovered that Caspian looked especially terrifying at this moment. He looked at the time, unable to help himself, and realized that it was exactly 10:30. It was exactly the time Caspian had mentioned. Wendell's death in front of everyone in Hoff residence would harm the reputation of the Hoff family as well, but Charles dared not say anything. He would not dare to stop Caspian even if he were to kill Wendell with his bare hands. Caspian was too powerful. It was not a good idea to antagonize Caspian now. However, Jackson was the one who killed Wendell following Alton's orders. What was Caspian's true identity? All the documents about him were encrypted, and even the governor made things easier for him. Could an ordinary man enjoy this treatment? This was surely not a coincidence. At the same time, this meant that Caspian was not an ordinary man. Now, Charles was more curious. How much power did the people backing Caspian up possess? Caspian raised his glass and came over to Charles, smiling. "Thank you for the banquet, Mr. Hoff Sr. I've never attended one with such plentiful and scrumptious food before." Charles grimaced awkwardly. "I'm glad that you're satisfied, Mr. Lynch. You can come here anytime you want to." "Ha ha ha. Ah, maybe not. With your old age, Mr. Hoff Sr., I fear that you won't be able to handle it if I show up here more than a few times," Caspian said sarcastically. Charles chuckled upon hearing that. If Caspian really did torture him like this, he would not be able to handle it. "The god of gambling, it seems that I won this bet," Caspian said after looking at the time. "Yes, it's you who won, Mr. Lynch. I've made lots of bets after being in New Bay for decades, and I have no complaints about losing this bet," Charles said, giving Jean a look. "What are you standing there for, Jean? Give Mr. Lynch the money." "Sure thing, Dad." Jean looked resigned. Not only did Caspian eat and drink his fill in Hoff residence, but he had also gotten a man killed here. However, the Hoff family dared not say anything about it. In addition, they had to take out money and give it to Caspian. The Hoff family had never been treated this way, but they dared not antagonize Caspian now. "Mr. Lynch, this is a check for $800 million. Jean took out a check and presented it to Caspian with both hands. "Ha ha ha. This is mine. All the money I've lost is back." Before Caspian could take it, Carl snatched the check from Jean's hands. This was his lifeline, after all. At this moment, there was nothing but money on Carl's mind. He did not care about who was dead or not. He just wanted his money back. He could boast about it after returning to Stewart residence. 800 million was almost what half of the Stewart family's properties were worth. No one would look down on him again with this. Looking at how emotional Carl was, Caspian shook his head. He could not say anything to that, though. Caspian turned to Charles and said, "If you don't need us for anything, Mr. Hoff Sr., we'll take our leave now." "Sure, I won't see you off." Charles still had that ugly grimace on his face. "If you ever want to have a chat with me, Mr. Hoff Sr., I can visit again," Caspian said with a smile, looking at Charles. Charles was so angry he almost laughed. He wanted nothing more than for Caspian to never come to New Bay again his whole life. He would be worried and panicked the entire day as long as Caspian was here. Caspian looped his arm around Willow's waist and prepared to leave Hoff residence. Caspian Lynch! Just as they were about to leave, someone else called his name, sounding enraged. Caspian turned back to see Celestia glare at him angrily. Caspian Lynch, I'll kill you with my own hands to avenge my father. Just wait, Celestia spat out vengefully. She and Caspian had a deadly feud between them. At this moment, she wanted nothing more than to cut Caspian up into pieces. She knew clearly that she was no match for Caspian, what with the power he possessed. Really? I'll wait for it then, Caspian said disdainfully before leaving Hoff residence with Willow. Caspian did not even regard Wendell as an opponent, so why would he treat Celestia seriously when she was just a feeble lady? The head of the York family was dead now. What could Celestia even do? She said that she wanted to kill him by her own hands despite being so powerless. What a lofty dream. Looking at Caspian's back as he walked away, the rage in Celestia's heart grew. Celestia bent down to look at Wendell's corpse and whispered, "Dad, I'll think of a way to kill Caspian and avenge you." After that, she bent over it and started to cry. "I'm so sorry. I didn't expect things to get so out of hand. As Mr. York has died in Hoff residence, I'm partially responsible as well. If you ever need any help, I'll try my best to provide it to you," Charles, who had walked over, said apologetically. He'd assumed that no one would dare lay a hand on Wendell when he was also present in the room. But then Deputy Gibson had directly barged in with a group of soldiers. Even though he was quite a powerful figure in New Bay, he would not dare antagonize a subordinate of the governor. He would be courting his own death otherwise. "No, thanks. The York family doesn't need your insincere pit," Celestia said after wiping her tears. She hoisted Wendell's body onto her back and got ready to leave Hoff residence. Wendell's corpse was heavy, and Celestia was only an ordinary woman who was not physically strong. Even so, every step she took was firm, seemingly a representation of her determination to take revenge. Looking at Celestia's determined silhouette, Charles shook his head. He could sense that Celestia would experience a lot of growth after this. Revenge would become the main plot line of her life. However, who knew if she would ever have the chance to take revenge on Caspian? Chapter 320, The God of Gambling Must Fall. After Celestia's departure, Cole left Hoff residence without a word, as this was what he should do in this situation. He had been silent the whole night, and he had done nothing as well. No one could guess what was on his mind. After the banquet, Hoff residence was transformed back to how it always was before. Charles looked at the bloodstains on the ground and frowned. "Helpers, clean this up!" More than a dozen helpers quickly tidied up the hall. "Dad, Caspian Lynch is up to no good. Should we really just sit and wait for our downfall?" Jean asked in worry. Charles fell silent after hearing that. Thinking of what he had learned about Caspian today, he also started to worry. After a while, Charles said, "You're taking the earliest flight tomorrow to another country." "I'm not leaving. The Hoff family needs people here more than ever. I can never leave," Jean yelled, shaking his head. With Caspian's rude and arrogant attitude, it was obvious that he wanted to take action against the Hoff family. This was a key moment, and Jean must not leave. More than that, he must not leave his father here alone. "Stop saying those meaningless words. You must do as I say. No one knows when the Hoff family will be endangered, and I'm not fully confident that I can deal with Caspian. I don't want the Hoff family to end up with no successor, so you're going overseas until this passes. We have some properties there too, so you can return after the Hoff family has weathered through these difficulties," Charles said, brooking no refusal. After being in New Bay for decades, this was Charles' first time feeling such a sense of danger. He was the god of gambling in New Bay, but he was not fully confident that he would win against the mysterious Caspian. He was already old and wizened, so it would be fine if he died. But the Hoff family line must be sustained. His son was quite capable, and he was still young. As long as he survived, the Hoff family would still have a chance and would still have hope. "Dad, I can't just abandon you here. Let's leave together by plane tomorrow. We can sell all our business and properties in New Bay and never come back here," Jean cried. He did not want to leave this place so pathetically. However, judging from how nervous his father appeared to be, they were in a dangerous situation. Jean could not bear to leave his father alone in New Bay. It's not that I don't want to leave, my son. Caspian will surely take action against the Hoff family, so I must stay in New Bay. As long as you can leave this place safely, I have nothing else to worry about. Caspian wants to topple me. You've never done anything illegal, so Caspian won't do anything to you. Charles' eyes were filled with tears as he patted Jean on the shoulder. Charles knew clearly that Caspian wanted to deal with him first, so Caspian would surely monitor his actions. He wanted to buy more time for his son. I'll listen to you, Dad. I have an idea, though. Can you transfer all the wealth we own before I leave? Jean made up his mind before asking. Charles was hesitant for a while. All the properties owned by the family were located in New Bay, and they also owned liquid assets amounting to hundreds of billions. Caspian would surely go after him if he were to transfer his wealth. Maybe this would put his son in danger too. Dad, the family's lifeline is in New Bay. If you don't transfer our wealth, the family will be done for. And it'll be very hard for us to rise again. Jean advised his father after noticing Charles' hesitation. After some consideration, Charles said, Fine. Our time is limited though, so you only have half a day. No matter how much we end up transferring, you're leaving New Bay once time is up. Okay, got it, Jean said, elated. All the properties the family owned were in New Bay. If they were not transferred, what could he do even if he succeeded in escaping to another country? As long as he had enough capital, he would not need to worry for the rest of his life after his safety was ensured. Looking at Jean's expression of joy, Charles suddenly felt somewhat doomed. 800 million, it's really $800 million. Let's see who dares look down on me after I return to the residence this time. Carl was overjoyed as he held the check. He had come to New Bay with several dozen $million in hand, aiming to earn a huge sum of money so that he would be treated with respect by his family. He had achieved that goal now. Willow looked at her father now and felt somewhat resigned. He had changed. Willow, perhaps you can go back to South Lake first together with your father, Caspian said to Willow. Wouldn't it be nice if we went back together, honey? Willow asked in confusion. I can't go back now. I have some other matters to deal with. You should return to South Lake City first, Caspian said, shaking his head. Willow wanted to say something, but she paused. Recently, she had gotten used to being close to Caspian all the time. Now that they had to be apart, she was a little unaccustomed to it. We're going back to South Lake City? Let's go. I don't want to stay here any longer, Carl said excitedly. Now, he just wanted to go back to South Lake City quickly. He would cash out his check of $800 million, and everyone in the family would view him with high regard. He had suffered from so much in the many years living in Stewart residence, but had no way to vent his anger. He would take the chance to vent his emotions properly this time. When are you going back then? Willow asked. Don't worry. It'll just take a few days. About 3 or 4 days, Caspian said with a smile. You won't get into any danger, will you? Willow asked in worry. She did not know much about what Caspian was facing, but that banquet tonight had told her everything. Caspian was surely staying to deal with some difficult matters. Don't worry. Remember who I am? No one can ever threaten me, Caspian said, patting the back of Willow's hand. Caspian did not take Charles seriously. He just did not want Willow to witness too many bloody scenes. Willow was a kind woman, after all. Caspian did not want her to be faced with too much of the dark and violent. He wanted her to always have this kindness in her. Willow nodded. Got it. I'll wait for you in South Lake City. After that, she pressed a kiss on Caspian's cheek. She knew that she would not be able to help even if she stayed. She might even end up becoming a burden to Caspian. She might as well return to South Lake City so that Caspian could do anything he wanted without anything holding him back. Caspian was smiling, but his heart was filled with murderous intent. The Hoff family had exercised their tyranny in New Bay for years. They owned hundreds of casinos too, and countless people had lost everything they owned in these places. This was how the Hoff family had gradually accumulated their wealth. For peace to be restored in New Bay, and for the people here to live peaceful lives, the Hoff family must be eliminated.